If you think about secret agents, men like George Smiley and James Bond, they're always loners, with no family getting in the way or posing any risk to national secrets. Well, Mr. Dudley Doherty wasn't your average spy. First of all, his wife Joan was an ASIO agent too. And second of all, much more unusually, their 3 young kids were in on the spy game too. The Dohertys were a family spying operation living in the Brisbane suburbs at the height of the Cold War. A few years ago, the middle Doherty child, Sue-Ellen, who's now a woman in her 60s, started to tell the story of her childhood to journalist Sandra Hogan. The result is Sandra's book, With My Little Eye, the incredible true story of a family of spies in the suburbs. And Sue-Ellen Kusher is my guest on Conversations today. Hi, Sue-Ellen.
Howdy.
Tell me a little about that suburb that your family lived in. Where did you move in 1963?
Look, we moved from Barden, which was the edge of civilisation in Brisbane at that time, out to the sticks, which was the Gap, and there was no bus service out there. It was, everyone was like, you are going bush. And we're talking about the Gap.
And what was significant about the day that you moved in, the 22nd of November?
Oh, my goodness, that day. I'd never moved house up until this point. We'd moved twice now. And as the vans rolled up, the ABC news was always on, either radio or television. And, of course, that was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And my father just looked at Mum and said, I'm gone, and just evaporated. And we were used to that. That was a very normal occurrence in our family, but not that day. Poor Mum, like 3 kids, a moving house. She was not terribly well at that stage, so it was a lot.
When your dad was at home, Sue-Ellen, was he the one in charge?
Life was about Dad, but Mum was in charge. So there was a hierarchy on our house. It was reinforced to us. Australia in the job came first, Dad came second, Mum came third, and we kids came fourth, and that was okay.
You always knew that your parents worked for ASIO, but what would you tell kids at school if they asked what your dad did for a job?
I was asked in grade 1 on about day 3 or day 4 what my father did. So the teacher went round the class and I didn't know how to answer that question. I had no idea. So that night we asked Mum, what do we say to that? And she said, tell them that he works for the government. That's so boring, no one will take any notice.
And I suppose it wasn't a lie, was it?
No. And then when teachers probed a bit more, I said, Mum, I need a better answer than that. And she said, tell them that he works for the Attorney General's Department. And no one ever wanted to know any more than that. It worked.
Who was it, Sue-Ellen, that your mum and dad were spying on? I mean, who was posing a risk in Brisbane in the 1950s and 60s?
It was more communities. So for the first, I would say, 11, maybe 12 years of my life, I existed in the Chinese community. All our friends were Chinese. We bought from Chinese produce providers. We were entertained by Chinese. We went to Chinese events. So my life was very much in the Chinese community. And Dad knew every Chinese person in Queensland. That was his job, to track them. And then when Yugoslavia was invaded, suddenly it wasn't Chinese. It was all the various forms of Yugoslavian cultures. And that was really tricky because we could never mention one name in front of another name. So we had to keep those groups very, very separate. And it's probably good that happened when we were older because there was a lot more complexity about keeping the secrets from the Serbians and the Croatians and the Montenegrins. And so there were, very definite groups.
So as well as those distinct ethnic communities within Brisbane, there were political agitators or potential political agitators that your dad wanted to keep an eye on. Where would you go to find those?
We'd do number plate checks and people checks at Trades Hall quite often. So,
and what was Trades Hall?
Trades Hall was where a lot of the radicals gathered. So we were always checking up on who was there, and we do drive past there all the time and do number plate runs. That park in the valley, that was where everyone, all the agitators used to on a Sunday afternoon get up on their soapboxes and, hell and brimstone and, the wind would be blowing through the leaves and the leaves would be rustling and you couldn't really hear them and there'd be spittle coming out of their mouths. And so for me it was very dramatic. But that was where a lot of extremists had their say. So we spent a lot of time there. We went to all the marches.
Well, tell me about the marches, particularly that big Labor Day march, the May Day march. What do you remember about that?
That was an on day. So that was a day where we were all on. Sometimes I would take a friend with me because that was really good cover. And Dad would position us in a certain spot. So we might sit in the gutter and he'd walk around with his camera and people would let him through because he was trying to take a photo of the cute little kids. But he was not taking photos of us. He was taking photos of people in the crowds. So photo runs were a very regular thing. So any event like a march or, in those days they used to have bands in the park and people would gather to listen to a band. So any of those events we would be present at. But it was always work.
And this, of course, the 1950s and 60s, this is really when that battle over the ideology of communism versus capitalism is really front and centre. It's something people are talking about and agitating about out in the streets.
And people were frightened. They were really, really fearful. We also had the religious divide between the Protestants and the Catholics. So there was that to manipulate, to manoeuvre rather. People were terrified. The Second World War was still quite raw. So, as a little child, I literally grew into a very, very political environment that I had no interest in whatsoever.
When you were out at those meetings or the May Day parades and your dad was interacting with people on the street, what was he like? What kind of manner did he have?
Oh, people loved him. Look, this is part of what I'm fascinated by. The ASIO agents, the good ones, they had such a unique quality. And I mean, a lot of my study was trying to understand what that quality was. They were middle of the road. They were not so middle of the road that they stood out because they were boring, and they were not so middle of the road that they stood out in any other way. They were so good at melting in, at charming people. Their charm barometer was amazing, and people loved them. And you would have a conversation with one of the ASIO agents and you would have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. You would find yourself telling them things that you just wouldn't tell anyone else. And at the end of it, you'd kind of scratch your head and say, well, he didn't really tell me anything. They were so skilled.
Do you think your dad genuinely liked people?
Oh, yes. Yeah. When he was 15 and he had his big accident and the Salvation Army rescued him, I think he very much absorbed that giving back, looking after the community, because that was one of the reasons the book ended up. I wanted to understand how he balanced all of those conflicting demands and ethics and values in his own body, because I don't know how that happened.
What accident had he had at 15?
When he was 15, he was running for a tram. It had been raining and there was a cigarette butt on that little first step that you'd step onto on a tram. He slipped and went under the tram, and the tram went over him and he lost his leg. 10 days before he sat his matriculation exam. Still sat the exam, still passed.
So your dad with one leg and a wooden leg and three little kids and often his wife is out around Trades Union at Speaker's Corner or at Chinese restaurants, chatting with people, being friendly, getting information. Was it good cover, do you think, having you and your brother and sister and your mum there?
Extremely good cover. Excellent cover. Because there was We were always working, but there was a switch. There was an on-off switch, and there would be these micro movements from my parents, and we would just know, right, behave. You are on. Don't mess up. Don't make a mistake. Watch what you're doing. Be careful. Observe. Remember. Behave. Conform. And we would just go into that pre-established behaviour. So we didn't deter from the whole event, and what it meant was that we could play with the kids and we could distract, and he and my mother could concentrate on the adults and what was actually happening.
And if you were a communist sympathiser or some other potential danger, you probably wouldn't be noticing a family man. You wouldn't be thinking that was an agent.
That's the really extraordinary part. That is not allowed in ASIO. So in ASIO, most of the wives don't even know that their husbands work for ASIO. The cover story that they had and the elegant setup that they had so that wives didn't know was quite fabulous. So wives didn't know, and families certainly didn't know and were never involved. Now, I know we broke that rule. I still have not found other families yet that, broke that rule because it was such a risky thing to do.
What kind of car did your parents have?
Boring car, always. The most boring Holden, the most revolting colours, those horrible colours. And we used to beg Dad, can't we get a yellow one? They were replaced every 2 years, and they were always the worst colour. And they were the most popular colour.
And so that was part of just blending in.
Yeah.
And how did you and your brother and sister help your dad carry out surveillance in that car?
We would go on runs, so we'd take a bag full of clothes. So we always had a bag of clothes ready, and we would change positions in the car. We would change clothing in the car so that each time Dad drove around the block, anyone looking would see a different configuration in the car. The car was a very normal, average, popular car, so it wasn't really identifiable in any way. And during those runs, we'd be hiding sometimes and we'd be sitting up sometimes. And if we were sitting up, we would be taking number plates and observing people and giving Dad a report at the end.
When you say taking number plates, writing them down? Or
No, just remembering them. So we'd each say, I'll take the other car, you take the red car. Well, they weren't red cars, but, you take the blue car. And we would each remember a number plate, and then later on we would give Dad the make and the car and the number plate so that he could go and check.
And were they skills that your mum and dad sort of explicitly taught you guys?
Yes, but I didn't realise that until I was an adult. But yes, we were being coached all the time. Games were always games that extended your mind, extended your attention, heightened all of your senses. And I think that was the one thing they did. They really made all our senses active, to the point where Mum and Dad were very fascinated by ESP, so extrasensory perception, and my mother could get my father to ring her, and my father could get my mother to ring her. And now there were not a lot of phones, and there were not many public phones, but they could. Mum would say, "Oh God, I need to talk to Dudley," and 5 to 10 minutes later he would ring.
It's very convenient.
It was fabulous. We used to try. We kids used to try. We were pretty good, but we weren't as good as them.
So did you always know that you were spies, your parents were spies, or was there a moment when it was revealed?
In my head and heart, I worked for my father and my father worked for ASIO. That's how I sorted it out in my head. And my siblings have said a very similar thing. We didn't work for ASIO, we worked for Dad.
And that was always the case?
That was always the case.
Did any of you ever tell anyone outside the family, like friends at school or teachers, the truth about
the first time I told anyone was my husband. I have no idea, but we certainly never slipped up when Dad was alive, ever.
Does that surprise you looking back to think a little kid?
God, I'm a parent, hell yes. I mean, it's extraordinary. But they were smart. They Sandra has grilled us on this. How did they do that?
Sandra, who wrote
the book. She was, every time we would have a conversation, she would be on this, like, how did they do that? So I've thought about it a lot. It was the senses. They did have micro movements that you wouldn't notice, but we would notice. And we knew how to interpret those micro movements. And we had very strict rules that were not to be broken. We had constant repetition. So we were constantly told that if we made a mistake, it wasn't just our mistake. It was the family's mistake, and we were putting Australia at risk. So there were massive consequences for us stepping out of those lines and stepping out of those boundaries. We had very clear expectations, and which we all wanted to meet because we all wanted mum and dad's approval, which all kids do. It's just that it was very much on the surface in our life. And those rules and those expectations were constantly reinforced.
Did your dad ever bring any other ASIO colleagues home?
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, Mum really was extraordinary. Dad would turn up with 6 people for dinner out of the blue.
And what did you call them? I mean, did you know they were working with your dad?
Oh, look, that was all part of the rules. You said hello, you were polite. If you were invited to sit and talk, you were allowed to sit and talk. If not, you went into your room and you stayed clear. So there were, again, rules around when people came to the house. But yes, my sister woke up one day and there was a Japanese geisha in the bed in her bedroom next to her. My dad he would visit ships. I loved going to the ships with him. He would go and visit ships, and all of a sudden the people from the ships would be coming home with him. And, one day a Nigerian interpreter with an Indonesian lady turned up and Dad said, well, we're going for a drive because the girls want to see the bush. Yeah, no questions asked. We never asked any questions. It was like, okay.
So when your little sister woke up and there is a completely strange to her Japanese woman in the bed next to her.
Didn't ask any questions. Got up, had a shower, went to school.
Did your dad ever take you into the ASIO offices, Sue-Ellen?
He did. Or not into the office. So he would take us with him, and that was a really big treat. That was like a reward for us to go into the office, because the biggest secret back then was the location of the office. That was never to be divulged. So we would go into the office and...
where was it? Can you divulge it now?
It was in the city somewhere. Old training still sticks. And I can still picture it. I can still see it in my mind's eye. And there was this beautiful lift, and it was polished timber, and it always smelt clean, and it had wrought iron, those concertina wrought iron doors, and the lift driver would pull the doors together. I mean, to me it was like a concert. I just loved it. And he would take everyone else to their floors, and then he would take us to the secret floor.
Secret floor?
Yeah, so the floor didn't appear on the panel. And he would take us to this secret floor and open the doors, and we would go into the ASIO offices. But there was another level. So you would go in, and the only woman that up until recently, that I had ever seen attached to ASIO other than my mother, was the secretary that was sitting at the front. And we would sit with her, and Dad would go into the office. But that was such a big treat for us. And she would let me play with the typewriter. Oh, I just thought it was wonderful.
Did your dad have any gadgets, like anything like Q might have made for Bond?
Oh, gosh, yes. He had tiny little cameras. And, in those days, cameras were huge. So he had this tiny little camera that was almost like a data stick size. He had a lock-picking kit that I coveted it so much. It was just so intriguing to me. A leather roll that he would roll out, and it would have all these instruments in it. Oh, it was so alluring. I was never allowed to touch it. He had a dictaphone. Now, houses didn't even have phones. He had a dictaphone. In the in the surveillance van, they could talk to each other. So one car could talk to another car. You know, that was just so far ahead in the future. But someone recently has told me that a lot of that would have come out of the technology from the Second War.
Did he wear disguises?
No, never.
His disguise was to be ordinary.
His disguise was to be as mainstream and as middle of the... He wore the most boring suits and the most boring ties and the most boring black shoes and had, you know, the I call it the IBM haircut, you know, the brill creamed haircut. But he was charming.
What about that wooden leg? Was that ever used to conceal something? Do you know?
Who knows? Who knows? I'm sure it was, and I'm sure I was never told. But it was interesting. People would argue with us when he died and we said, oh, you know, his wooden leg. They would say, well, he didn't have a wooden leg. We'd say, yes, he did.
Spies were a big part of popular culture back in the 60s, 50s and 60s. Did you ever watch shows like Get Smart?
Gosh, yes. Oh, yes. Had a great giggle. A great giggle, except a lot of it was close to home.
Like what?
Well, the secret lift, the gadgets, you know, the cone of silence. We had a cone of silence. We used to really laugh at that.
You had a just agreed cone of silence. You didn't actually have the cone come down between Chief and Maxwell.
Yeah. No, that's right. 86 was not there. But we definitely had a virtual cone of silence.
It must have been so, I don't know whether it would have been surreal or a relief to see a version of your family life up there on TV as entertainment.
I don't think we connected what we were doing with what you and your listeners might think of as spycraft. I don't think we made that connection. My brother might have, because my brother was a very political creature and he's the more academic person in the family and he was always interested, whereas I kind of rejected. I didn't want to know too much because that was too hard for me to handle.
As well as the trade union meetings and speakers' corners, your mum and dad went along to meetings at the Brisbane UFO Society. Yep. Why was that?
They explored anything and everything. And during that time, Van Daniken had written a series of books about unidentified flying objects. And it was very, very popular. And this is not long after we had just put man on the moon. And that was so amazing and so extraordinary and so surreal. So people started to become very, very interested in the skies, in the planets, talking about the fact that we cannot be the only organism out there that has, you know, evolved. And so there was a UFO society and it was very robust and my parents went religiously to the UFO society.
Was that for ASIO work or was that private interest?
My parents did nothing that was not for ASIO. Everything was work. The P&C was work. Their friends were work. We'd go for a walk down the road, that would be work. Like, my parents were never off.
Did you go along to the UFO Society meetings too? What did you make of it?
I loved it. I you know, my brother thought they were a bit wacky. I loved the passion. You know, to be in a place in those times, which were very strict staid times, to be with a room of lateral thinkers who had no boundaries and who were so passionate about what they were doing, to a little energy junkie like me, it was like putting me in the socket and filling me up. I loved it.
You knew how to behave, Sue-Ellen, according to your mum and dad's expectations in public. But what was going on inside that little brain of yours? You know, how were you coping with all the secrets, all the stuff that you knew you weren't meant to share? How did you handle that?
Well, first of all, I knew nothing else. We knew no differently. But it wasn't until Sandra managed to get all three of the siblings to talk at the same time that we realised we all did the same thing in different ways. So I had a compartment in my brain. I had like a treasure chest in my brain. And if it was a secret or select information, it went into that box and I locked it and I never visited it. Because one of the first things we were taught was what a secret was and what you do with a secret. And that is never divulged, ever. So we were taught about the Commonwealth Secrets Act. We were taught that, you know, we were bound by that act. So it was not a choice. If we were told it was a secret, it went into that box and it did not come out.
Did that make it really hard to form friendships with other kids?
No, because it was a secret life. So when you don't talk about it, you don't think about it, it doesn't invade. It did eventually invade when I was, a very mature adult. But at that time, because that's how we grew up, that locked compartment was, as I'm telling you this, I'm pushing two hands away. It was kind of over in one part of my being, and the other part of my being I could surrender fully to just being a kid. So there was kind of an on-off switch.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
I remember in high school history learning about the Petrovs, who were two Russian defectors. There's a famous photo of Mrs. Petrov being hustled onto an aeroplane and losing a shoe. It was all very dramatic. How did the Petrovs come into your life?
We'd been transferred from Sydney to Brisbane. We had just moved into the house that we had bought. I think we'd only been there 3 or 4 days. And Dad came home and said, we're going on holiday. We were like, wow, this never happens. Yeah. And he said, oh, there's someone else coming with us. I went, okay. So what do we call them? Well, we couldn't call them by their real names. So somehow we made up this name for her, and we always called her Pee-wee. And I never referred to him as anything because I was always shushed away if he was around. I'm a very sensory person. I didn't like the vibe I got from him, so I stayed clear of him. But Pee-wee, I absolutely loved.
So these were two high-ranking Russian officials who had defected to Australia in 1954. Why were they needing to be with the Doherty family on holiday in 1956?
So when we had the Olympics in Melbourne, the officials knew that the KGB were going to send people out to try and either assassinate them or to kidnap them, or both. So they knew that they were under great threat. So they went through a process of finding a cover family for them. We were their second choice, not their first choice. And so in that 6 to 8 week period where no one ever knew where they were with us.
So to hide out from the KGB during the Melbourne Olympics, the Petrovs come and stay with the Doherty family.
In full view.
And you went on a holiday together to the Gold Coast.
Oh, we went to the Gold Coast. That was fabulous. They had the apartment upstairs. We had the apartment downstairs. Dad and my brother Mark and Mr. Petrov, I never called him anything else, Mr. Petrov, Mr. P I used to call him, would go fishing. See, he was a mad fisherman. So they'd go out fishing and Mum and Pee-wee and I, they'd cook, they'd talk, they'd go shopping. We'd go to the hotel down in Surfers Paradise and they had a swing in the beer garden. I'd swing my life away with pink lemonade in the beer garden and they'd chat.
And who were they supposed to be? I mean, these two
just people
Russians.
On holidays. Dad said, just pretend they're your grandparents.
And how was the cover blown?
Mr. Petrov, he was not a very nice man. He loved alcohol. He loved talking. And a Russian accent at that time, there weren't any.
And his photo would have been they were known figures.
Yes.
These were famous defectors.
Yeah. So he'd escape all the time. Poor Dad. He would constantly escape and go to the pub and start getting drunk and telling stories. So we were packing up and moving all the time, trying to run away from whoever was starting to tweak at the Gold Coast. We then went to Redcliffe.
What, like on a chase you went to Redcliffe, or what do you remember?
From the Gold Coast we were chased. So there were cars behind us, and Dad was a very careful driver, and I was in the back hiding. So I was in the hump down the back of the old cars, and I said to Mum, "Why is Dad driving? Why is he driving like a racing car driver?" And she said, "Oh, we're just having an adventure. We're playing chasey." I was like, "Oh, okay."
Who would have been chasing them?
Well, that would have been either the media or the KGB or both. I don't know. I was only a little kid. So I only know what I was told.
Where did you end up?
We went to Redcliffe and to a motel that was about to open, so it was empty. So we had the bottom apartment, they had the top apartment, and we'd go over. Then we ended up at Dickies Beach at one stage. Then we ended up at Noosa at one stage. So there was a lot of moving and chasing, but I was told it was an adventure, so it was an adventure.
It wouldn't have just been, risky for the Petrovs if their cover was blown. Your whole family too. I mean, what would you have said at school about how to justify that you've been photographed on holiday with the most famous Russian defectors in Australia?
Happen, thank God. I don't know, but we would have been given a cover story. In those environments where it was unusual, we did get cover stories. So we would get, if anyone asks you a question, here's what you say. So we always had that story, and it was never a lie. It was always part of the truth. Mum always taught us the worst thing you can do is lie. So you tell enough of the truth that satisfies the other person, but that doesn't put the story in danger. So we became very good spin doctors. And
it paid off. The Petrovs survived the 1956 Olympics and left your life and...
Never saw them again, but that's the job.
There were places, Sue-Ellen, that your dad visited where you kids couldn't come along. Why were you all once left waiting in the family car in a car park along the Brisbane River?
Once? That was a constant thing. We'd go for a drive and Dad would say, "Oh, I'm just going to call in here." And he'd just pull into a curb and I wouldn't have a clue. Mum wouldn't know where he was going. But years later, I remember a lot of those places. I've got a very good spatial memory. And I would remember, and I'd be in the car with Mum and I'd say, "That's one of the places Dad used to take us." And Mum would go, And there was one on Coronation Drive, and I said to her, "He used to go in there a lot, and he used to keep us waiting a long time." And she'd say, "Yes." And I said to her, "What was up there?" And I was old enough for her to say to me, "Well, they were brothels." And I'd say, "Well, what's Dad doing in a brothel?" Now, one of the things that they did was they never gave us a straight answer. They would make us work for the information so that we would figure out the answer ourselves. So, see, we're always being trained. So I said, "Well, why would he go into a brothel?" And she said, "Well, why would he?" And I said, "Well, I hope not for the normal reason." I said, "Who's in a brothel?" And she said, "Think about it. Who visits a brothel?" And she said, "Politicians visit brothels. People visiting from another country or another state visit brothels." So she said, "Dad has contacts in there, so he's going to get a debrief." And then years later, I said to my mother one day as we were driving along, "Do you think he got a bit more than a debrief while he was in there?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, I'd have to be an idiot to think he didn't."
It seems so cruel for him to have left your mum and you kids in the car outside.
No toilet. No water.
I'm not even thinking about that. I'm just thinking about what it must have done to your mum, sitting there thinking he's inside.
Yeah.
And I've got to wait here for him and keep it together for the kids.
I believe my mother saw my father as her rescuer. He rescued her. And she would do absolutely anything for him. And I have not a doubt in any part of my body that they absolutely loved each other. They were so passionate and so unified. They were such a unit. I think he could have done anything to her. She would have complained, but she would never have done anything about it.
Who was your dad's best friend?
When he was in the army, I only learned this as an adult. When he was in the army, he had a corporal. So my father was in logistics and he had a corporal, and the name of the corporal was Abe Saffron. And Abe Saffron is, of course, the criminal
King of the Cross.
King of the Cross. So he ended up in some very dicey and questionable deals, environments, And my father was studying to be an accountant when he went into the army, and he did Abe Saffron's books. Now, I'm not sure if he did the real ones or if he did the ones for the taxation department, but every year my dad would go down and audit the books. And
every year?
Yeah.
Even after he became an ASIO agent?
I understand so, but because my father evaporated a lot, I have no idea where he was or what he was doing. But my mum tells me that every year he did the books for Abe Saffron.
How did your dad first come to join ASIO?
He was recruited. So in 1947, when the Act was passed, they then had to look for people who had a certain level of training and a certain way of thinking that they could very quickly absorb into that security environment. And he was recommended by someone, and he was one of the very first recruits.
Was he already married to your mum when he joined?
No, they had been going out for a long time. And he was going to go to country New South Wales and open a gun shop. And Mum was not really keen on that, but she hadn't said anything because she'd do anything Dad said. But he came home one day and he said, I've been offered this other job. I've got to make a decision. What do you think we should do? And she said, well, it's a regular job, da-da-da-da-da. And he said, oh, okay, then, well, they like married couples, so we'd better get married.
Well, that's a proposal.
Oh, look. Kusher men and Doherty men are really known for their romantic gene.
So they get married and your dad joins ASIO. How did your mum, Joan, come to also join?
Look, this blows my mind. So Mum had been a telephonist. She wanted to be a surgeon. Her father wouldn't let her go to university. So she's got a really good mind. And Dad said to her after he'd been there maybe a year or two, I think you'd better resign and come and work with me. And she said, why? And he said, well, they like it if there's a husband and wife team. If they're going to have women in the office, you know, there's a less risk. So you'd better come and work with me. But what I found out years later, when Australia decided to write the official history, I had no idea until that time, my mother had the top secret job.
What did she do?
So there was a small room that was, even in ASIO, there were secrets within ASIO. So this was a secret room within ASIO.
In the Sydney offices?
In the Sydney office, that obviously only one or two people knew about. She and another woman, believe it or not, called Joan, so the two Joans, would work in this office on 12-hour shifts, and they would listen to every bugging tape. So every bug that was placed in any phone, in any apartment, in any building, they would go through those tapes for keywords, key names, key phrases, addresses, any detail that they could extract. Now, the thing that blows your mind is these two women had no training. None of those tapes were in English.
What?
They were in a range of foreign languages.
So were they just typing phonetically or listening out for words?
They learned. They learned on the job. I can remember my mother having German lessons. She picked up Russian quite easily.
That is such a high-level job.
Unbelievable. And I kind of was a bit doubting that it was as dramatic as my mother had said. So when I actually met the other Joan at the launch of the ASIO's official history in Canberra, I said, right, Joan, tell me about how you did your job. And she said, oh, I don't know. She said, we were just told to do it. So if they told us to do it, I guess they thought we could do it, so we just had to. I was like, and then I said to her, what did you do? And her story was so consistent with my mother's story. I thought, my God, this story is true.
Your mum and dad get married. They're both working for ASIO.
Yeah.
They move into a little apartment, have your big brother,
Yep.
Mark, and then have you.
Me.
And what's going on in the apartment alongside looking after two little babies?
So I can remember being taken to the park from that apartment. I can remember some of the people that I met in that apartment. But what I now know is that Mum and Dad, on behalf of ASIO, were bugging the apartment that was below, that was occupied by a high-ranking Russian person who had a lot of high-ranking officials visiting him. And so in the middle of our very small apartment in King's Cross was the biggest piece of recording equipment you've ever seen in your life, you know, with those great big huge wheels of tape that one went to the other, with a technician sitting there with the massive earphones. So there was someone sitting in our apartment listening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mum had 2 babies that she had to keep quiet, and there was no insulation, so you had to keep quiet enough so that the bugging equipment worked. And the very exclusive and highly technical bugging technique was to drill a hole through the roof and put a microphone down there. So that's as much as I know. But what I have later learned is that was their first ever operation, and it was a really critical operation. And there were a lot more people watching the building, you know, other cells doing other activities around that same operation.
How long did your mum stay as an official employee of ASIO?
Until just after I was born. But as Mum said, she just became an unpaid employee then. So she was an agent as long as my father was an agent. She just wasn't paid.
Tell me where you were in October 1970 and October 1970. What were you doing?
I was at Davies Park in Brisbane. I was at a concert by Johnny O'Keefe. I can remember he had a green satin shirt on. I didn't really want to go, but I'd said to this boy, I can't even remember his name, I'd said I would go. So we went, and in the end, he just said to me, "You're not having a good time, are you?" And I said, "No, I really want to go home." I don't know. I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew something was wrong. There's that old ESP, I guess. And the closer we got to home, the more agitated I got. Someone came out of the front door. That was unusual. The lights were on. That was unusual. And I just couldn't walk inside. I said, "You have to tell me what's going on. I can't go inside until I know." And they said, "You know, your dad's died."
What had happened to your dad?
He'd had a heart attack. So I can only assume the stress of the job, the fact that he was an amputee. So his heart literally exploded.
As you say, you weren't there. Did you see his body, Sue-Ellen?
I did. I insisted on going to the morgue because I hadn't seen him die. And my brother and my mother begged me not to go, and I said, "I have to." So I went to the morgue. Then I asked them to open the casket, and that was a big argument. They finally opened the casket. It didn't look like my father.
What do you mean?
Well, the hair was too perfect, and his lips were blue, and they'd put pink lipstick over the top. And, you know, that wasn't right. But the thing that really got me was they had his hands folded on his chest, and he had his wedding ring on. My father never wore a wedding ring. And it was shiny. It was bright and shiny. And I thought he would never wear a shiny wedding ring because it's too identifiable. So I convinced myself it wasn't him. I just did not believe that was my father's body.
How long did that idea that your dad hadn't actually died, wasn't the person in that casket, how long did that stay in your head?
It's a very embarrassing question to ask me, Sarah, because I was 60 before I actually accepted that he was dead.
What do you think had happened to him?
I thought he was off on a mission. I thought this was just another cover story because Dad disappeared all the time. So I thought, okay, everyone is acting like he's dead. I've got to act like he's dead, but I am not at all convinced that he is dead. I was totally open to the possibility that he wasn't dead. And there had been so many extraordinary events in the world of people disappearing. You know, Harold Holt had disappeared, and there was all the press around, you know, submarines whisking him off. So there were all these events that were happening, and in my mind it was like, well, there is a reasonable possibility that this is another escape act.
Did you ever think that you'd seen him, spotted him somewhere on the street?
Yeah, definitely. Dad had a very certain walk because of his wooden leg. He had a very certain walk. He had a very certain shaped frame, and the back of his neck had a very certain pattern of creases. So I would glance, I'd just grab a glance of someone walking down the street that was his shape, his size, same hair colour, I'd follow them. I'd follow them until I could see the back of their neck and go, that's not him. But I often expected him just to turn up, just to suddenly appear. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I started to really think that through, how completely and utterly disrespectful that would have been to my mother. What kind of man would do that to a family? It wasn't until I had a family of my own and I realised what that meant that I started to really question myself, would he really do that?
What conversation did you have with your mum about it?
It was after Sandra had finally got my mother to agree to talk, and I looked at her and I said, Mum, Dad really is dead, isn't he? And she looked at me and she said, yes, darling, he's always been dead. I went, okay. So, and that was the moment I finally accepted. It was a bit of a relief because I didn't want my dad to be the person who just left, because it was devastating when he died. We didn't just lose Dad. We lost our life. We lost our network. We lost everything, because the day after Dad died, 2 agents turned up at our house to remind us that we were still bound by the Secrets Act and always would be.
When did you start talking to people? I mean, did you talk your brother and sister? Did the 3 of you
We
talk
kind of
about
huddled. No, because what's in that box is in that box. You don't talk. We didn't talk about it. The family did not have those conversations because you don't know who's listening.
When did that change? How did that
Not
change?
until Sandra came along.
And why were you ready to talk to a journalist?
I was watching Who Do You Think You Are? And I suddenly realised that my kids would have no way of tracking their family. None. And I thought, that's not right. I want there to be some trail. And I knew that there were a lot of stories that even ASIO didn't know about my dad.
Did you have to get clearance from ASIO before you could start having these conversations, let alone have a book?
I asked Sandra if we could write a book about my father. That's where we started. She couldn't verify any information. We just hit brick wall after brick wall after brick wall. And then we found out that Mum was actually the more secret one. So that was another set of brick walls that we couldn't penetrate. But in the meantime, wonderful Julia Gillard had agreed to have an official history written. So when the official history was published, that's public information in a public domain. So that allowed us to use a lot of that information from that time.
What do you think now, Sue-Ellen, about your dad in particular, given what you've learnt?
What do I think? I still don't know how he ethically lived with it all. That's the thing that really intrigues me. I know he loved my mother. I know he was having relationships with a lot of other people. I don't know how you put that together, but he obviously did. He was a staunch Liberal voter. He had a socialist heart and behaviour. I don't know how he put that together. Our name's Doherty, so he was very happy to let anyone think that we were Catholic, but we were brought up Protestant and he was Salvation Army. So I wanted to know how in his head and heart and being all of that worked together, and I still don't know, but that's okay. And it was very interesting when I went to the launch of the 2nd volume of the history, because that was in the new ASIO building in Canberra with security like it would take your breath away. I've never seen anything like it in my life. They almost pulled your teeth out before you went into the building. But I saw a lot of Dad's contemporaries, and I was there with my mother at a time before the Alzheimer's had really kicked in. And she was explaining to me who a lot of the people were, because she remembered. And they all have this quality about them. They're gentlemanly, They're very conservative looking. When they cast their eyes on you, it is like nothing else in the world matters except you and what you are saying to me. And there's this twinkle of naughtiness about all of them. They will just do something that is so random and out of midstream that you go, ooh, you're interesting. And they all do it. That I find mesmerising. What is that and how do you learn it?
Given that you grew up just soaked in the kind of spycraft skills, even though you weren't conscious that that's what they were at the time, the noticing number plates, the identifying if people were moving, looking at cars, do you still find yourself doing that?
Oh, gosh, yes. I'll still walk down the street and avoid someone. I'll go and hide and watch them. I mean, it's pathetic, but I do it. I'll be in the shopping centre and see someone I know and I'll duck and watch them, and then I'll say to myself, what are you doing, woman? I still do number plates. If there's a stupid, crazy driver on the road, I'll take their number plate and remember it. What for? God knows. I'm highly observant. You know, I am that observation and noticing and interpreting skill it's stood me in good stead.
Sue-Ellen, what a story. Thank you so much for telling us it on Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
Subscribe to listen to more free podcasts or download the ABC Listen app and stream ad-free.